By the year 2084, humanity had realized that living on the surface of Mars was a death sentence. The radiation was too high, the dust storms too abrasive, and the thin atmosphere offered no protection from the relentless bombardment of cosmic rays. We needed to go deeper. We found our salvation in the Arsia Mons region, a massive volcanic shield containing lava tubes so vast they could swallow the entire city of Manhattan. This was the beginning of Project Genesis. The descent was the most dangerous engineering feat in human history. We weren't just building a base, we were sealing a prehistoric volcanic vein to create a pressurized, breathable world underground. I remember the first time the floodlights hit the walls of the tube. They weren't just rock. They were smooth obsidian-like glass forged by ancient Martian fire billions of years ago. It felt less like a construction site and more like we were entering the throat of a sleeping giant. The challenges were immediate. The basalt was harder than any drill bit we had brought from Earth, and the silence of the deep crust was psychological torture for the first wave of engineers. We were kilometers beneath a world that wanted us dead, relying on experimental AI to maintain the structural integrity of a ceiling that weighed billions of tons. But as the first hydrothermal vents were tapped and the dark cavern began to glow with the artificial light of a new civilization, we realized we hadn't just found a shelter. We had found a way to make Mars feel like home. Once the structural integrity of the Arsia Mons tube was secured, the next challenge was the soul of the city: light. Living kilometers beneath the surface meant we were forever cut off from the sun. To solve this, Project Genesis didn't rely on harsh electric bulbs. Instead, we turned to the beauty of synthetic biology. We engineered a new species of bioluminescent moss and genetically modified trees that could thrive in the nitrogen-rich atmosphere of the cavern. Within a decade, the obsidian walls of the lava tube were no longer black. They were covered in a pulsating emerald glow that mimicked the natural rhythms of Earth's day and night cycles. These glowing forests didn't just provide light, they became our primary source of oxygen and water filtration. Walking through the central district of Genesis feels like walking through a neon rainforest. The air is thick with the scent of damp earth and ozone, a smell that many of the first-generation Martian colonists had only ever known through digital simulations. But the beauty of the Emerald Cavern hides a fragile equilibrium. The entire ecosystem is managed by the Central Life Support Core, an AI system that monitors every leaf and every drop of moisture. If the bioluminescence fades, it means the oxygen levels are dropping. If the trees begin to wilt, the city's water supply is at risk. We aren't just living in a city, we are living inside a giant breathing lung. We have traded the radiation of the surface for a life of constant vigilance, where the flicker of a single glowing flower could be the difference between survival and extinction. By the second decade of Project Genesis, a new and terrifying sound began to echo through the emerald corridors, the sound of the mountain groaning. On Earth, we are used to the ground being solid, but on Mars, inside a lava tube large enough to hold a skyscraper, the physics are different. To keep the air breathable for 80,000 citizens, the internal atmospheric pressure must be kept at a constant level. This creates a massive outward force, literally trying to push the walls of the cavern into the Martian crust. Above us, however, are billions of tons of volcanic rock pressing down with the weight of an entire world. We call it the pressure war. Every structural engineer in Genesis lives in a state of high alert, monitoring the massive titanium bulkheads that segment the tube into safety zones. If one section fails, the pressure difference would create a supersonic wind tunnel, pulling everything and everyone into the cold, airless void of the next unpressurized chamber. I remember the night the Arsia sector shifted. The sound wasn't a crack. It was a deep, resonant hum that vibrated in the very teeth of every person in the city. The obsidian walls, once thought to be indestructible, began to weep liquid silica, a sign that the rock itself was beginning to deform under the atmospheric stress. The solution was as radical as it was dangerous. The central AI decided to vent the heat from the hydrothermal reactors directly into the surrounding rock layers. The goal was to slightly melt and then refreeze the outer shell of the tube, creating a glass jacket that would reinforce the entire city. For 3 days, the temperature in the city rose to a sweltering 40 degrees Celsius. The emerald moss turned brown, and the bioluminescent trees flickered and died. We sat in the dark, listening to the scream of the basalt as it expanded and cracked. We weren't just living in a city anymore. We were living inside a pressurized experiment that could turn into a tomb at any second. For all the dangers of living underground, we often forgot about the world we left behind on the surface. That changed during the solar storm of 2092. A massive coronal mass ejection from the sun slammed into the Martian atmosphere, triggering a series of lightning-charged dust storms more violent than anything recorded in human history. On the surface, the winds reached speeds that could strip the paint off a rover in seconds. But it wasn't the wind that threatened Project Genesis. It was the seismic shock of a meteorite strike. Without a thick atmosphere to burn up incoming debris, a stray nickel-iron asteroid the size of a shipping container slammed into the Arsia Mons plateau, directly above our central residential sector. The impact didn't collapse the tube, but it did something worse. It created a micro-fracture in the basalt ceiling, a hairline crack that stretched for 2 kilometers. For the people living in the Emerald districts below, the sky literally began to fall, not in chunks of rock, but in a fine radioactive dust that began to seep through the bioluminescent moss. The emergency sirens, a sound rarely heard in the history of the colony, tore through the artificial peace of the cavern. We weren't just facing a structural failure, we were facing a breach of our planetary seal. If the crack expanded, the internal pressure we had worked so hard to maintain would vent out like a punctured balloon, freezing the city in a matter of minutes. The repair teams had to do the impossible. They couldn't patch the crack from the inside because the outward pressure was too great. They had to go to the surface, into the heart of the radioactive dust storm, to deploy a liquid polymer seal. I watched the live feeds from the security monitors as the drones and the armored suits struggled to stay upright in the 300-kilometer-per-hour winds. It was a race between the vacuum of space and the ingenuity of human engineering. Every second the crack remained open, the city's oxygen levels dropped by 1%. We were no longer a thriving civilization. We were a group of survivors, huddled in a dark basement, watching the ceiling and praying that the glass jacket we had forged in the pressure war would hold for just 1 more hour. The polymer seal held, but the surface breach of 2092 changed the soul of Project Genesis forever. We realized that we could no longer be a city hiding from the red world above. We had to become a civilization that dominated it. In the decades that followed the Great Repair, the lava tube was no longer just a shelter. It became the foundation of a planetary nervous system. We began to link the Arsia Mons tube to dozens of other volcanic veins across the Tharsis Plateau, creating a subterranean network of pressurized highways and emerald forests that stretched for thousands of kilometers. As the city grew, the technology we used to survive the pressure war evolved into something miraculous. The liquid silica that once threatened to crush us was now harvested to create a new type of transparent ceramic, harder than diamond and clearer than glass. We used it to build massive skylights on the Martian surface, gigantic domes that allowed the pale Martian sun to finally touch the floors of our underground paradise. For the first time in history, children born on Mars could look up from their bioluminescent gardens and see the stars without the fear of radiation. We had turned a dark volcanic tomb into a cathedral of human ingenuity. But the true climax of Project Genesis wasn't the engineering, it was the biological transformation. The synthetic moss and neon trees that once served as our lungs began to adapt. They started to produce seeds that could survive the harsh salts of the Martian topsoil. We began a process called micro-terraforming, venting the excess oxygen and warmth from our underground cities into small protected craters on the surface. Within a century, the area around Arsia Mons was no longer a barren wasteland of red dust. It was a patchwork of silver-green lichen and hardy Martian shrubs, the first true signs of a planet coming back to life. Project Genesis proved that humanity didn't need Earth to thrive. We learned that we could take the most hostile environment in the solar system and turn its very dangers, its volcanic heat, its crushing pressure, and its obsidian depths, into the tools of our salvation. As the city of Genesis expanded to accommodate over 1 million citizens, it became the capital of a new, multi-planetary species. The silence of the Martian caves was replaced by the sound of a thriving civilization, the laughter of children who had never known the weight of Earth's gravity and the constant hum of a world that refused to die. I look out now through the great skylight of the Arsia sector. Below me, the emerald lights of the city pulse like a living heart. Above me, the sky is no longer just a source of death. It is a canvas for our future. We have moved from being guests on this planet to being its masters. Project Genesis was the beginning of the end for the old era of humanity. We are no longer sons and daughters of Earth. We are the architects of the stars, the dwellers in the deep, and the masters of the red fire. The city in the tube was just the first step. Today, Mars, tomorrow, the moons of Jupiter. Our journey has only just begun.